Okay, I owe you an apology. I have not been doing a good enough job of talking about what actually matters. And in this video, I'm going to try to make things right. I am going to try to dive into some very valuable information on how to actually adjust your fantasy football draft strategy and take advantage of an inefficiency in the market, or at least an inefficiency that I believe to be in the market. But before we dive into it, please go down there, drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football, leave a comment letting me know how stupid I am. You know, I always enjoy those comments. But let's go right into this and let's talk about the importance of a singular position that usually doesn't get much coverage, because we know it's fun to talk running backs, it's fun to talk wide receivers, but tight ends, you have your elite guys where there's not too many questions except this season. And then you have those long shots, and usually the tight ends in the middle rounds are mainly disappointing. They are mainly just fool's gold. They are the sirens trying to convince you to go deviate from a wide receiver in the middle rounds. And sometimes I get suckered in. I will admit that. But this tight end position is so important if you're going to look at your ability to either finish first or second place in your 12-team league. Now, of course, this isn't an advertisement for RotoViz, but they have a very cool tool on their website where you're actually able to go and see the advanced rates for underdog fantasy best ball teams last year. Now, if you are unfamiliar with what that actually means, if you advance out of your 12-team underdog draft, that means you had either a first place or a second place finish. So if you advanced, say 20% of the times, that means instead of on average, a basic team, an average team, if you were just dead average, you're going to advance about 16.5% of your leagues. But if a player is able to get up to 20% of those teams advancing, that meant that they had a meaningful season that actually changed your outcome. Of course, you can go look at guys on the far end. I mean, you can go and pull up the Cooper Kupp last year. Cooper Kupp advanced 48% of his teams to the playoffs. You had Deebo Samuel advancing 33% of his teams. You had Mike Evans advancing 30% of his teams. Those are ridiculous numbers. Those are numbers that are laughable to think about, in that if you just take every player that drafted Cooper Kupp and you say, what were your odds to get either first or second place if you drafted Cooper Kupp in the 4th, 5th round, wherever you took him? Your odds to get first or second place, it was almost a coin flip, 50-50, based off that one selection overall. And if we go through and try to determine how important the tight end position is, it's going to be a little bit difficult, because if we map out how many players had a 20% advance rate or higher, you come to 7 quarterbacks, you come to 12 running backs, 24 wide receivers, and 9 tight ends. So if you just look at those numbers, you're like, okay, wide receiver, that's what wins your league. Just draft your receivers over and over and over again. But we have to remember, there are a ton of wide receivers being drafted. If we go over to Underdog Fantasy right now and we see how many wide receivers are being drafted inside the top 200 picks, you have 87 wide receivers going off the board. And if we compare this to other positions, you have 61 running backs, you have 26 quarterbacks, and you have 26 tight ends. So if we do a percentage basis, and if things were to remain the same as last year, you have about 27% of those quarterbacks being drafted, giving you the odds that you're looking for to get first or second place in your league. You have about 27% of those wide receivers as well. You have about 20% of those running backs turning into league-winning options. But 35% of those tight ends are going to actually dictate if you get first or second place in your 12-team league. If we look at those tight ends that had that win rate, that advance rate over 20% this past year, you have a list of Rob Gronkowski, Mark Andrews, Dawson Knox, Zach Ertz, Pat Frymuth, Hunter Henry, Dalton Schultz, Jared Cook, and Tyler Conklin. Now, of course, it's not necessarily that, okay, these are the tight ends that scored the most points, because it comes with the opportunity cost. If you draft Dalton Schultz and he adds 87 points on your fantasy team that wouldn't have been there, and you drafted him in the last round of your fantasy draft, that is going to be exponentially more valuable than drafting, say, Travis Kelce, who were to add about 120 points to your starting lineup. So if you are looking at these discrepancies, there's one thing that really stands out. Getting that either elite level tight end like a Mark Andrews or hitting on a tight end extremely late is going to be almost more valuable than anything else in fantasy football. And if we take this information, if we take this knowledge to this upcoming season, based on these advance rates, your initial reaction should be, okay, I could never go ahead and draft a tight end early on Underdog Fantasy. I should be waiting until around 17, 18. I should be taking a tight end there almost every single time, whether that's Austin Hooper, whether that's Trey McBride. I'm going to go find my favorite option. That would be at least my initial take whenever I look at this information. But of course, we are looking at a 1-year sample. What we need to do is we need to take a step back. We need to reevaluate because Kelce was not a good player to draft last year, despite Travis Kelce having an impressive season. Travis Kelce was the tight end 2 on a points per game basis. Travis Kelce averaged 70 receiving yards a game for a tight end. That's very good. However, if you had to take Travis Kelce in round 1, he just wasn't getting you enough production to have an above average advance rate. But I will say, last season was just last season. We'll get to some information about 2020 that I think will be very valuable. But first off, let me give a shout out to Underdog Fantasy for sponsoring this video. We're talking about drafts over there on Underdog Fantasy because I'm addicted. I've done almost 300 drafts at this point. By the time you watch this video, I've probably done over 300 drafts over there on Underdog Fantasy because there's nothing more fun than you can do than hopping in some real money fantasy football drafts. And when you go to Underdog Fantasy and you use promo code FLOCK when you sign up, they will match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to 100. So you're getting paid to play in fantasy football leagues. You'll get our 2022 rankings, our dynasty rankings, our dynasty rookie draft guide, and you'll support this channel. But let's go over to what happened in best ball leagues back in 2020. Because this is going to be very telling. This is a year that Travis Kelce went in round 2. Travis Kelce went in round 2, and Travis Kelce went out there and broke records. Instead of averaging 70 receiving yards a game like he did this past season, Travis Kelce averaged 94 receiving yards a game. Instead of having a below average advance rate, Travis Kelce was the most valuable player in fantasy football. Alvin Kamara was the running back 1 in fantasy this year, and Travis Kelce had a win rate. That's first place, not first or second. He had a win rate at 24%. That's comparable to what Cooper Kupp was at last year. So despite us not necessarily seeing one of those elite level tight ends like a Darren Waller, a George Kittle, a Travis Kelce last season coming out and being a mega producer and winning you your fantasy football league, you just have to go back to 2020. You have to take 2 steps back to see that the impact of having one of those truly elite level tight ends, even if you were to take them early, can still give you a significant edge in your fantasy football league, where Kelce gave you the largest edge of any player in fantasy in 2020. And you're looking at Mark Andrews as also a league winner, even though Mark Andrews was going the 5th round this past season instead of the 2nd. So what I want to do now is I want to dive into these elite level tight ends and talk about which guys I think we should go ahead and look to target, which players that we should possibly look to avoid. And of course, we'll dive into deeper tight ends, maybe some sleepers later on. So if you're not already, subscribe to the channel and we will get to that in another video. But let's start it off with Travis Kelce, because Kelce, as we already stated, he was a round 1 tight end last year and he was not good. He was good from a fantasy football standpoint, but for the opportunity cost and the players that you had to pass up on for Travis Kelce, it was, I don't want to say a wasted pick, but you had much better options in that range of the draft. And here, if we're looking at Kelce, he's going a little bit cheaper, but he's still a late round 1 selection, early round 2. And I hate to go back to the well to someone we lost money on last year, but I find myself drafting Travis Kelce yet again. And this is him going into his age 33 season, which that has to be concerning. You're never wanting to draft a 33-year-old player in round 1 or round 2 of your fantasy football draft. But we're looking at Kelce as a tight end that should now almost see a higher target share than what he's had over the past 3 years. Travis Kelce has averaged a target share slightly under 23% from 2019 to 2021. And the departure of Tyreek Hill, while yes, we could possibly assume that this is going to impact the overall offensive efficiency in a pretty negative way, it will still open up so much volume where we can't necessarily be that certain that you're going to have Juju Smith-Schuster taking it all. We can't be certain that you're going to have Marquez Valdes-Scantling taking it all. We can't be certain that you're going to have Sky Moore taking this production entirely. And I know a lot of people are going to say, okay, well, Mason, they're going to divide everything up. All three of those wide receivers are going to equal Tyreek Hill. There's an issue with that. The issue is the secondary wide receivers that you had in Kansas City last season are also gone. It's not like you have Juju Smith-Schuster, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, and Sky Moore all combining just to take that Tyreek Hill production. You also have Byron Pringle going to Chicago. You have DeMarcus Robinson going over to Las Vegas. And while those weren't players that were necessarily going out there and dominating in terms of just racking up points where you could put them in your starting lineup, there's still options that were commanding volume that can go to Juju. Like if you just take that production that you had from Byron Pringle and DeMarcus Robinson and say you just give that to Sky Moore, are you going to be that surprised if that's his rookie season stat line? Personally, I'm not going to. And I'm also not going to project the combination of Juju Smith-Schuster and Marquez Valdes-Scantling to take all that Tyreek Hill volume, every Tyreek Hill target. And I know we're going to have some people coming out saying, well, Mason, you're not taking into account one thing. The Kansas City Chiefs are just no longer going to be the number one offense in the NFL this past season. They are probably going to slide behind someone like Dallas, Tampa, Buffalo with the departure of Tyreek Hill. Of course, Patrick Mahomes is still going to have this team as a top 10 overall offense, but maybe they're just not going to be number one overall anymore. And I got news for you. They weren't last year either. I feel like it's almost hard for Kansas City to fall much further in overall points scored compared to where they were at last season. Last season, they were already behind Dallas. They're already behind Tampa. They're already behind Buffalo. So while maybe we assume that this offense gets slightly worse with the departure of Tyreek Hill, I am not necessarily counting out for the fact that you have Patrick Mahomes is still a team that can easily be a top 5 offense overall. And if you're going to see this team be a top 5 offense with Patrick Mahomes and you have no Tyreek Hill, the targets per route run, the target share, the yards per route run as well, they're probably all going to be coming up for Travis Kelce this upcoming season. So I am going right back to the well. I'm completely fine drafting Travis Kelce at the end of round 1, the beginning of round 2, especially because you take Kelce like all these other elite level tight ends. You only have to take 2 tight ends total, and you save one of those roster spots at the end for either a dart throw at running back, dart throw at receiver, or maybe you need to draft 3 quarterbacks. But now let's go over to our next tight end, someone that's been falling lately. I've seen him go at the end of the second round a lot, which I don't understand the fall. You have Mark Andrews. Now with Mark Andrews, yes, he was the guy that went out there and absolutely crushed it last year. He was the tight end 1 overall in fantasy, and at the same time, he had a 28% advance rate. A 28% advance rate is absolutely ridiculous, only behind Rob Gronkowski, who costed absolutely nothing last season. And if you look at Mark Andrews, he's averaged almost a top 3 finish at the tight end position over the past 3 seasons. And I will go out and talk about the negative with Mark Andrews that everybody wants to point to. And this is going to be the pass to run ratio that the Baltimore Ravens had in 2021 being an extreme outlier. And this makes sense. I mean, you have the Baltimore Ravens in 2021 averaging almost 36 pass attempts a game compared to 2020 where they're at 25 pass attempts a game. And the reason for this is, hell, you lose J.K. Dobbins, you lose Gus Edwards before the season even starts. You lose a couple key defensive players as well. So it's not like you're leading in just all these games where you're able to slow down the pace of play in the second half. So this just is not great to see this outlier in overall pass attempts in this offense and see this massive random bump up from about 6 targets a game in 2019 and in 2020 to 9 targets a game in 2021. That is concerning for Mark Andrews, especially because when you add back in Lamar Jackson, when you add back in J.K. Dobbins, when you add in Gus Edwards, when you bring in Mike Davis, when you have a better defense overall, and we can assume that the Baltimore Ravens are probably going to be leading the majority of these games, it's going to be a team that looks to run the ball significantly more than they did last year. And that's concerning considering the fact that Mark Andrews didn't really change his role. He didn't really change anything about himself in this offense this past season outside of offensive volume. Because you look at Mark Andrews, he had a 25% team target share in 2021. which is great. That's elite. That's better than Travis Kelce has ever posted, but it's not too much different than him at 24% in 2020, 24% in 2019. So if you see this overall passing volume fall down from the Baltimore Ravens, we can assume that maybe the points per game go right back down to what it was in 2020, what it was in 2019. However, while there will be a drop in passing volume, and I'm going to be the first person to admit it, I am still going to be drafting Mark Andrews in the second round, as I think that you can see Mark Andrews as one of these key specific players with an outlier season with this overall fantasy points per target, fantasy points per route run, an incredible touchdown rate. Because if you look at the piss poor quarterback play that he had last year, where yeah, he was averaging 2.5 targets more per game, but at the same time, they were coming from Tyler Huntley, who had a 5.1 adjusted yards per pass attempt mark this past season. And if we compare this to Lamar Jackson's career average with his adjusted yards per pass attempt is 7.7. I think the efficiency actually gets a bump up for Mark Andrews. Hollywood Brown's gone. That's 25% of this team's target share out the window. I'm expecting some regression for Mark Andrews, but looking at him next to some of the other wide receivers that he's being drafted behind, I'm completely fine buying into Andrews here. Now, our next tight end did not just put up the best rookie tight end season of all time. He would have dominated if his position wasn't tight end and if instead he had the wide receiver classification. This is Mr. Kyle Pitts, who, yes, finished as the tight end 11 last year. Yes, if you look at his advanced rate, it wasn't fantastic, but the man was so unlucky. He averaged a touchdown rate of 0.09%. This is the same player that had a touchdown and a half a game his final season at Florida. This is the same player that has the largest wingspan in the entire NFL. This is just pure variance. This is something that's not predictive at all going forward. And if you're looking at his raw points per game, you're doing yourself a disservice. Because if we go ahead and look at how impressive this season was, even if he was a wide receiver, and we just say, hell, he averaged 6.5 targets a game. He averaged about 63 receiving yards per game. Who were wide receivers that were able to do that as rookies at 20 years old in particular? The players, whether you're a receiver or a tight end, you're 21 years old as a rookie, and you average 6.5 targets a game, and you average over 62 receiving yards a game. You have Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Keenan Allen, Amari Cooper, Mike Evans, and Kyle Pitts. Just think on that for a second. Think on that list of receivers and on average what they were able to do in year two. And think on what you could have potentially done if you were able to slide that player into your tight end position. We've never seen it. I mean, I guess maybe we saw it with Travis Kelce whenever Kelce was 26, 27. We have not seen that from a year two player. We've never seen this type of rookie season production. And I know a lot of people are going to say, well, Mason, it's going to be different this year. They have no Matt Ryan. And at the same time, they brought in Drake London. They have a very, very solid wide receiver that they're able to throw out there. They're able to funnel him some targets. Kyle Pitts was the only guy in that offense last season. They had to go to him that often. My friend, let's go through and let's look at how many targets, how many touches are available in Atlanta this upcoming season. Because don't forget, Russell Gage got paid $30 million to go to Tampa. Mike Davis, no longer there. Hayden Hurst, no longer there. Wayne Gallman, no longer there. Tajay Sharp, Calvin Ridley, all gone this season. You have 272 targets and 166 carries available in this offense. You don't have Drake London taking all of that. It's not possible. Kyle Pitts will see a massive jump up in both his targets per game and yes, maybe the yards per target go down. Even if Pitts gets better, you have the downgrade going for Matt Ryan and Marcus Mariota. But if you get the jump up in opportunity going into year two that any of those other wide receivers had, and you combine that with some positive touchdown variance where maybe instead of averaging less than 1% of your targets to touchdowns, Maybe that's closer to league average, like 6-7%, even though I would assume that Kyle Pitts is an outlier in the positive direction in that single statistic. I hate to say this. I know last year it didn't work out, but looking at how important the tight end position is overall for your win rate and looking at what Travis Kelce did to unlock elite fantasy football teams in 2020, if we are drafting these large field best ball tournaments, I'm fine taking Kelce at the end of round 1, the beginning of round 2. I'm fine taking Mark Andrews in the middle of round 2. I'm fine taking Kyle Pitts in the middle of round 3. These players all have their own question marks, but they all have strengths that could lead them to being that next cheat code to break fantasy football. Now, thank you. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please go down there, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comment section what you're thinking. But I appreciate you. I hope you have a great day, and I hope we get to see you with the live stream tonight.